Dr. Thomas Abowd is a professor at the Anthropology Department at Tufts University. He is a Columbia University graduate where he earned a PhD in Cultural Anthropology. Throughout his career, he received numerous awards, the latest being a Fullbright Fellowship to do research in Jerusalem. He is author of the upcoming book Colonial Jerusalem, The Spatial Construction of Identity and Difference in a Divided City. Currently, he is working on a study of racial politics in Detroit that details Arab American and Black class, racial, and gendered encounters. Today, we bring you coverage of his talk from Umass Dartmouth entitled No Hope. Can the Obama administration play a positive role in building peace in Palestine and Syria? Dr. Abowd covers the conflict in Palestine with some focus on land confiscation by the State of Israel. He also discusses U.S. foreign policy in the region and its bias towards Israel, as well as current unrest in Syria.
Thank you all for coming. I know you're getting toward the end of your term, and so every hour that you need to carve out for your own studies and your own lives are particularly important at this time of year, so thanks for coming. You know, the title of tonight's talk, as you see on the poster, is Can the Obama administration play a positive role in bringing peace to Syria, Israel, Palestine? And that is essentially what I'm going to be talking about, themes relating to the United States, U.S. foreign policy, the Obama administration, and these two very important segments of the Middle East, where two enduring conflicts have been raging for a while. But I also want to, you know, the titles that appear on posters, and by the way, this is the one I gave, so I'm not blaming anyone but me, they're not always the most important questions to ask. And so I want to ask another and try to answer another question, because just by way of introduction, it's important to understand that for as powerful as the United States government is, any change in U.S. foreign policy with regard to these two areas, Syria and Israel, Palestine, and I argue that policy needs to change, those changes don't just come because governments decide one day to change policy. The real question is, what are Americans going to do to change U.S. foreign policy if you see that if you believe that it should be changed or needs to be changed? And I will argue that it is. So the answer to all these questions I'll try to answer. But, you know, it should be mentioned, one of the reasons I would pose a question like this, should U.S. policy change, is because in the last 50 or 60 years, for those students of the Middle East particularly, you will know, the role of the U.S. government in the Middle East in terms of promoting peace, justice, and democracy has been quite lamentable, not particularly good. If you were to grade policy, you'd have to grade the policy based on what the regimes in the Middle East, who are most supported, most highly armed, most highly supported, what their human rights record is like. And if you look at, if you look at Morocco in the West and you go all the way to Iraq and even Iran as part of the Middle East in the East, you see really a string of dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, Syria and Israel, Palestine being in sort of in the geographic center of that region. From west to east, there's been a real correlation between U.S. arms, supplying of U.S. arms to regimes and aid to those regimes. There's been a correlation between that kind of support and instances of torture, instances of colonization, instances of authoritarianism. So the track record up until this point, and many of us who study the region thought that maybe, just maybe, Obama's administration would change that, given that he actually, for all of the criticisms one can make, he is a worldly guy who's quite smart, and long before he became president, for those who know a little bit of his history, he had a very proud history as a community organizer, as an activist, and also someone who knew a lot about Israel-Palestine before he decided to go to the heights of the political establishment. So we sort of hoped, those of us who were around 2008, old enough to vote, and I'm looking out in the audience, probably very few of you were able to vote in 2008, but those of us who were thought that we weren't totally hopeful, but we thought maybe he would shift policy a little bit. And the sad fact is that the Obama administration the last 4 years, over the last 4 years, has not really changed course much from the previous administration in terms of promoting justice and democracy in the region. The same authoritarian governments, Saudi Arabia, Egypt until Mubarak was overthrown, throughout the region, the Gulf Emirates and the monarchies in Jordan and elsewhere, where real democracy does not exist and where real activists who are fighting for democracy are often imprisoned and tortured and or disappear, that hasn't much changed. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is and what we might do to push our government to change its policy in the interests of democracy and human rights and justice. So that's very important. Now, it's in the context of this talk, we're talking about Syria, for instance, and also Israel-Palestine. It's important to understand the civil war that's emerging in Syria, which has taken the lives of over 33,000 people in the last couple of years alone, Syria is one of 3 or 4 countries in the Middle East that have undergone pretty intense civil wars over the last couple of decades. The other is Iraq, and the other principal one being Lebanon, and of course Algeria in the 1990s. But the same kind of problems that have arisen since the Second Gulf War in Iraq, which I think can be termed very much the condition of civil war and civil strife, has now arisen in Syria, where you have a full-blown, quite toxic and violent civil war. And in Lebanon, historically, in the 70s and 80s, those some of you I know, you or your parents were there, witnessed in Lebanon a civil war in a very tiny country, a population of 4 or 5 million, in which about 110,000 people died from about 1974, 75 until 1989, 1990. So what's happening and unfolding in Syria is quite severe, but it is also part of a sort of continuation of a very difficult context of civil war in the region. Now, why concentrate on the United States? Why have a talk just on that focuses on U.S. foreign policy? Well, as many of you know, in a world where the premier superpower, the arguably sole military power in the world, is able to exercise unrivaled military power, no longer unrivaled economic power, as we know, but military power is still unrivaled. In that kind of political situation, things like international law and democracy and democratization are not always the primary goals or aims of a regime that has sort of unmatched power. If you can use military force and impose your political and economic will on other parts of the world, as the British Empire did before the U.S. supplanted it as the major superpower, then you do it. It's sort of like, if there are any Sopranos fans in here, as the author Noam Chomsky said, it's really kind of like the Tony Soprano guide to politics. If you're a mafia chief and somebody steals money from you, or you want to extort money, you don't go to the cops, right? You don't go to the authority that's meant to enforce the law. You go and you break the guy's thumb. You break their kneecap. You don't go through international institutions if you're the world superpower. You don't go through the United Nations if the UN won't play the game you want. You go and you invade if you have to, or you install the regime that you want. And I think that's not too cynical of a notion, because that's in fact what we've seen over the course of the last several decades. And both in Syria, but also I want to show you, and I'll show you some slides, the unfolding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is now into its 66th year, has been a conflict in which the United States government, from the 60s all the way until the Obama administration, has unduly and in violation of international law backed the occupying power, namely the Israeli state, which continues to take and colonize and appropriate Palestinian land for the last almost 7 decades, and we'll get to that in a second. Just some quick facts about Syria on the one hand and Israel, Palestine on the other. I'll show you some slides as well. As I mentioned, the most recent stats on Syria are quite grim and gruesome. As of January, the last statistics I have come from Amnesty International, January 2013. And Amnesty International, the human rights organization, estimates that at least they have the names of 33,000 Syrians who've been killed in this conflict. So there are probably many more whose bodies have not been found, who've been disappeared, and who we may never find, but who are dead. But 33,000 in the last 24 months is a pretty grim stat. In addition to that, at least 1.2 million Syrians have been made refugees since the beginning of this uprising in March 2011. And if you think 1.5 million refugees sounds like a lot, but it's an even heavier statistic because the country is only about 20 million people. So if you, on the equivalent U.S. population base, 1 million refugees in Syria is about, it's roughly 5%, it would be the 5% of the U.S. population. That would be something like 15 million Americans made refugee in the last 2 years, thrust into Mexico, Canada. And when you think of that in local terms, it's quite significant. In addition to those 1.2 million Syrians, there are about another 1.5 million who've lost their homes in Syria. So they're what we call internally displaced. Now, in Palestine, Israel, here we go. Here's a map of contemporary Palestine, Israel. And for those who've studied it a little bit, you'll know that we have to talk about these two nations or countries together because, in fact, the white area that you see, which is the Israeli state within its internationally recognized boundaries, is in fact and was in fact built with just the white area, mostly on land that was taken from Palestinian people who became refugees in 1948. In the land that became Israel, it was established largely on Palestinian land. But then you have these two other areas, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which Israel has occupied militarily since 1967. The Gaza Strip it withdrew from in 2005, but continues a siege, a blockade around Gaza, keeping the Gazan population of about 1.5 million in sort of one large prison camp. The West Bank, which the Israeli state has put about 600,000 Jewish settlers in since 1967, is an area that has a majority Palestinian population, but is a place that the Israeli government has sought to appropriate and steal little by little, because in the West Bank, and you can see the shaded area of the West Bank, it is where most of the water reserves in the country exist. So Israel doesn't want to leave the West Bank, though the whole entire international community demands that it leave the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which is recognized internationally as Palestinian land, as land that has been taken from the Palestinians. Now someone would say, well, what about the land taken from the Palestinians in 1948? The answer to that is that international law does not recognize that as occupied territory. You could, or one could draw different perspectives on this. The Palestinians still demand the right to go back to that land, but the United Nations does recognize Israel within the boundaries of the white area. Okay, so you can see Israel and Palestine, which are two peoples, two nations, that are territorially bound up very close to one another. In fact, what we call Israel-Palestine is an area that's smaller than the state of New Jersey. So it's not a big area at all. So Palestinians, we're now in 2013, they're entering the 66th, 67th year of their condition as refugees from 1947-48. And 46 years under military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip since 1967. Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip is the longest single-running military occupation in the world. It's the longest continually running military occupation post-World War II since World War II. So it is, Palestinians, there are many other people who face quite dire conditions of life under military foreign rule that is not their government. The Palestinians have experienced it for just about longer than anyone else in the world since World War II. I want to give one statistic on sort of a basic fact that will give you a sense of what's going on. The population of Israel is about 7 million, and included in that is about 1.5 million Palestinians and about 5.5 million Israeli Jews. That's within the white area. In the West Bank and Gaza Strip, there are about 4 million Palestinians. And so what's arisen in the last year, and it just happened last year, was that even though the Israeli state had kicked out 70% of the Palestinian population in 1948, the population who stayed there has continued to grow such that we've just reached a tipping point where the population within Israel-Palestine, between the Jordan River, which you can see here, and the Mediterranean, is now majority Palestinian for the first time since 1948. So now Israel is confronted with this idea of how are they going to rule as, in fact, now a minority over a majority Palestinian population who they don't want to be part of their state, but whose land they want. And they've made this clear. This is pretty explicitly stated in successive Israeli government pronouncements. The Zionist claim was based on what their leadership called biblical promises. The leadership claimed that their reading of their sacred text with that they claimed that God had given them the land and that they're returning to the land, and that though the Palestinians are there, they're not the rightful owners because God gave them the land. It was basically a very strongly religious argument that was made, to which one could always respond, well, how would you feel, living on your land or in your house and someone knocking on your door and saying, in my reading of my holy book, this is now my house, and so you'll have to leave. Because it says it in this book that I believe is the Word of God. I mean, it doesn't... There are even, of course, many religious Jews who reject that reading of the Bible as real estate guide, or the Bible as, God as realtor. That is not something that resonates, but it was part of the Jewish national movement for a homeland in Palestine. So there was this conflict between the indigenous population who owned most of the country and were the majority of the population, about 70% of the population, and this new national movement that came mostly from Europe for Jewish nationhood. Britain and the United Nations decided in 1947 that they weren't going to allow a political solution to this crisis that would have one state where both people lived in. Partly that was their determination. I've gone through the colonial archives in the last year in London and looked through a lot of what the correspondence was internally, what British planners were saying. And basically, though the British were diverse, the British colonial officials were diverse in their views, there was at least a slight edge to their support for the Zionists. So they didn't want everyone to live in one state because the Palestinians would have been the majority, and they wanted to create a Jewish state with a Jewish majority.
A talk given by Dr. Thomas Abowd entitled No Hope, Can the Obama Administration Play a Positive Role in Building Peace in Palestine and Syria? We'll be back with the remainder of the presentation after this short program ID.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
A colonial military occupation in Israel, Palestine now, and we have a very severe civil war brewing in Syria at the moment. What can the U.S. do about it, and do we want the U.S. to do anything about it? There's been a question for years about whether the United States is unwilling or unable to force Israel to abide by international law and leave the West Bank and allow the Palestinians to set up a state. And my position, and the position I want to argue tonight, is that the U.S. government, as the sole superpower, is able, but not willing, to force Israel to abide by international law and to end the occupation. The U.S., I argue, could play a productive role in building peace in Israel, Palestine, and in Syria, but it will have to and its continued policy of siding with, in the case of Israel, the occupying power, and in the case of Syria, it will have to play a more productive role in bringing the parties in conflict to a diplomatic and negotiated settlement. So that, you know, nearly the entire international community wants the Assad regime in Syria, which has been part of a 40-year-old dictatorship, to go, and it must go. And I think justice demands that. But what's happening in Syria now in terms of the civil war is so destructive and has no end in sight that as long as the Russian state is arming the regime, and as long as other international external forces are arming particular elements within the rebels, it doesn't look like one side can prevail militarily, and this whole conflict could burn out could go on for many, many more years, sadly. Let me say one other thing. About U.S. policy in Israel-Palestine. And that is that since about the early 1970s, that is a couple years after Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza, it also occupied, as you can see on the map, a part of Syria called the Golan Heights, which it still holds, which has kind of been forgotten. In the mainstream media accounts, you rarely hear that fact mentioned, that Israel is still occupying part of Syria. It had occupied the Egyptian Sinai, but withdrew as part of an agreement with Egypt in the late 70s. But ever since the beginning of this now 46, 45-year-old occupation of the Palestinian West Bank, the United States has taken a particularly one-sided view and has sort of protected Israel and the international community against criticism. The Palestinian scholar Rashid Khalidi, who was a former negotiator between the Israelis and the Palestinians in the early 90s, has written this book about U.S. foreign policy called Brokers of Deceit that just came out. I recommend it. And it's subtitled How the U.S. Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East. And he argues, as someone who was actually involved in the negotiations with the U.S. and also Israel as a Palestinian, that the U.S. government in the course of negotiations was sometimes even more hardline than the Israelis in negotiating with the Palestinians. They were sometimes more Israeli than the Israelis in these negotiations. So the idea that the United States should lead or broker any kind of negotiation between the Palestinians, who are the occupied population, and the Israelis, who are the occupier, is, in his view, and my view too, kind of a joke. And it's kind of a joke because the international community is really in agreement on what should be done with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The United States and Israel lie outside a very broad international consensus on this subject matter. So, to give you just one example, almost every country, every other country in the world, China, India, Russia, Britain, France, Japan, South Africa, all support what's become known as the international consensus. And many of the other 180, some countries I left out, but I mentioned major ones. And that is that Israel's occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem must end, and that the Palestinian refugees, even 50, 60 years later, have the right, in principle, to return to their land. And the two countries in the world that have tried to block that broad international consensus have been the United States and Israel since 1967. So you have this very odd situation, and it speaks to what I talked about earlier, how the sole superpower can really stand in the way of quite a broad consensus. You have votes in the United Nations regularly on this, about resolving this conflict consistent with international law, the end of Israeli occupation. And the vote is routinely something like 159 to 2. And you know the 2. It's like X to 2, and you know, X being everyone who was not asleep that day at the UN. And sometimes the UN, you see sometimes the vote will be 3. You have the United States and Israel, and then they'll pull in like Samoa. Or nothing wrong with Samoa. Samoa's a wonderful island. I love the Samoans, but you know, it's an effort by the United States to try to drag in one other country so it doesn't look so bad.
That was coverage of the talk given by Dr. Thomas Abowd entitled No Hope. Can the Obama administration play a positive role in building peace in Palestine and Syria?
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
شهيدة الحب شهيدة البغض شهيدة نعمان الماء له أمان الماء له أمان الماء له أمان 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 يا صبي توجع الطاس مش مرتاح ويمكن اللي راح ما بقى يرجع قلبه قسي وشو قال وانصرته ظاهر تغيرته وتغير المرسال من قالوا لي اسألها أنا اسأل سامع عن لسانها حكي الخبر نعمان ينسى الهوى اللي كان ضيعان أيامي معه ضيعان يا الغريب خبريني منين بيقطفوا النسيان.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
Thank you so much for joining us. Some stations will be leaving us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. For those of you staying with us for the remainder of the hour, we hope you enjoy the last musical segment following the closing credits. On behalf of all of the volunteers here at the Arabic Hour, this is Ghanwa Hakim, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
The Arabic Hour has been brought to you in part by the William G. Abdullah Memorial Library, a resource center for information and education on the Arab American experience, the American Arabic Benevolent Association, ABBA, an umbrella association for community endeavors, the Nicholas G. Barham Veterans Association and Ladies Auxiliary, providing veteran services, scholarships with community pride, and by our members as well as contributions from viewers like you.
بكتب لك وبكتب